Hey, so today I'm going to try to do a video about more specifically what I believe caused my AvPD, which is to say social anxiety from fear and expectation of judgment, my hyperfixations, my fear of sharing interests and emotions, and my self-loathing, which causes depression. Um, so in short, this video is going to be about my parents, and I've been thinking about doing this video for a while, and a couple of people have asked about my relationship with my parents, and this is going to be difficult for me to do. It's hard enough to think about and harder to say it out loud where anybody could hear it. I feel guilty to talk about it. I don't want to blame anybody or make anyone feel bad, but I think it's important to talk about because I can help others understand themselves and work past their guilt. And perhaps help people that aren't dealing with this understand how the small things you do or say or don't do or say can be harmful to someone. So I'm going to go fairly chronologically here, and there might be a little bit of overlap with my life story video, but shouldn't be too bad. Although this will be fairly long, I will try my best not to ramble, but if you're going to watch this, buckle in. Um, so the first thing is I just kind of want to talk about what I think my parents wanted out of having children, because I don't think you should want anything super specific out of having children. I think you should just be ready to raise individuals and be happy with them. But I don't really feel like that was the case with my parents. Um, my mom wanted kids basically to be like teddy bears, just very mild-mannered and just there to receive love and, sort of inanimately give it back. Um, and it feels like she's never really been able to understand that all three of her children are her own people and not just her children. And my dad feels like he wanted kids, sort of, if to the extent that he did, as a legacy for himself. Just like this is what's left when he's gone, as he has three kids. And to him, what is important is being constantly hardworking and being in a career that he sees as respectable and being financially well off. And he sort of just wanted his children to do those things. He feels like getting a good job gives you an easy life, and otherwise you're going to have a hard life, and yourself as an individual doesn't really factor into it. It's just about working, basically. That's how it feels to me. So I sort of feel like my parents were always in a competition to prove which one of them was better to us. They cared about us, but they cared at least as much about getting their own way in arguments, and they had arguments over everything, smallest things that just didn't matter at all, that really wouldn't stop until one of us basically started crying. And it's not really surprising. I feel like my parents are incompatible human beings. My dad gets angry and he gets amused, and otherwise he doesn't really show any emotions. And my mom is excessively emotional. So I feel like you can see where this led to issues with emotional expression that would come up later, which is basically that my dad always preferred to not acknowledge when other people showed emotion and just act like it wasn't happening, or to look down on them. And my mom took everything way too far and put way too much importance into every little thing that happened and took it too personally. So it didn't matter who I was around, there was some equal and opposite difficulty with showing emotions, and that certainly didn't help, but we'll get into that more as I proceed. So when I was around 7 or 8, I'm not sure exactly, my parents divorced and separated, and so me and my siblings began shared custody, so we moved between my mom and dad's house twice a week, and we would alternate every weekend which parent had us, and that was the phrasing that people would use, which kind of made me feel like a possession, and not necessarily one that someone wanted, but anyway, it was good in some ways because it meant that there would be fewer face-to-face shouting matches, but as it turns out, they made up for that with arguments over the phone, and they cared even less about what our reactions were because they didn't have to feel any mutual embarrassment. The one that was dealing with us being in the room could just yell at the other one on the phone and ignore us and blame us or blame the other parent for whatever it is we were doing. And both of them drank a lot of alcohol and still do, which is why I will never touch alcohol. And they got a bit more violent sometimes. My dad used to pin me or my brother to a cabinet by our neck on occasions, not very often. And my mom would throw breakable objects, expensive shit, at walls and stuff. And when stuff like this happened, I would call the other parent and hoping that they could help calm the parent in the room down. But it just turned into an endless argument and served as fuel for their vendetta against each other, basically. And I eventually realized that they weren't going to be helpful, and I would just bail and go hide in my room whenever this sort of shit happened. And this did cause some anxiety immediately. It would be a bigger issue as I got older, but even around the time I developed some anxious habits, like I would bite holes in my thumbnails that lingered there for a long time after I stopped doing that. And I wrenched hair out of my head and left bald spots that I know people saw sometimes at school. And later, when I started getting acne, I started scratching my acne compulsively until it bled, which is something that I still do sometimes. You might have noticed that on my face a couple of times. It's not too bad recently, but it has happened a bit. So basically, my parents were just sort of fixated on their own difficulties with their lives falling apart, which I can understand to an extent. And they did take care of us. We weren't neglected in any way like that, but they didn't necessarily have energy to care about us as individuals. So not a lot of positive attention in the way of praise, or things like that. And if I wanted them to appreciate me at all, I basically had to go along with doing whatever it is that they wanted to do and what free time they had. So for my dad, that meant basically going along with fishing and hunting trips. I'm not a particularly outside person. I am more nowadays, but I wasn't as a child. And I've never been particularly patient, which doesn't, you need patience for those sorts of activities. Nor was I strong enough to hold a gun or dexterous enough to work a fishing rod. And I'm not really interested in killing animals, and I wasn't then either. So that was difficult for me to try to participate in, to just try to get him to look at me sometimes, not like he was mad at me, but like he was proud of me. And so I did that for some time, trying to get some good reaction. And with my mom, it more meant public outings, just family things, basically. And I didn't have severe social anxiety yet, so these events weren't bad in that way. But I did always worry about something going wrong because it seemed that something always did. Maybe my little brother would get worked up. And then my mom would call to blame my dad and argue about it, sometimes in public, sometimes right after we got out of public. And sometimes my dad would come along so we could try to be a family still, which, if you've experienced that, you probably realize that that doesn't work. And in my opinion, it was basically just them using us as an excuse to try to get back together and try to fix their lives. But anyway, these sorts of events always went poorly and made me anxious, and just were generally not things that I enjoyed doing, but things that I felt like I had to try to get some sort of appreciation from my parents as a kid. And so in school, I always felt like I had to do perfectly, not because I got rewarded or praised for doing well, but because my parents, especially my dad, made it very clear that if I didn't do well, I was going to have a hard life, basically. And the same thing applied behaviorally. He always liked to use the phrase "be the bigger man," which, isn't a bad idea. It is good to try to not start petty arguments, but he means it more in the sense of, if anything ever happens that's anyone is mad about, you're basically just supposed to step out of it and let yourself be walked over. At least that's how it seemed to me from reactions he had to certain things. So, I would always, starting on second grade, I would cry when I got not perfect grades because I was worried that I was going to screw up my whole life. And, I didn't really get a lot of reassurance that it was okay to not do perfectly. It was just like, it's not that big of a deal, get over it, do better next time. And as far as my interests go, my dad kind of just let us do whatever and didn't pay much attention to what we were doing. He didn't really care one way or the other. My mom was pretty restrictive for a while about what we could do, especially with the internet, of course, being around when I was a kid. But when we annoyed her long enough about the things we wanted to do around the time I started middle school, she let us pursue our interests on the internet more freely, but she still made her feelings very known about them. So some things that I got into around that time were RPG video games. That stands for role-playing games, if you're not familiar, as well as metal music. And so, she liked to still look at the things we were doing and make it known that she would prefer that we weren't doing them and say that they were evil, and or that the music I was listening to was more like noise anyway. And so I became really guarded with my interests and worried that I'd be judged as a bad person or just make people feel uncomfortable. Even though I knew I wasn't doing anything wrong, I just didn't want to take the chance to share the things I liked with other people until I already knew that they liked the same sorts of things, which is how I ended up with a few friends that I did have. They just turned out to like the same sorts of things as me, and they were a little more comfortable talking about them, and then I eventually opened up with them. So as I got older, I got dragged into arguments between my parents, more personally, and forced to take a side. And whenever I showed emotion in these arguments, I was told to calm down and shut up, and I was being unreasonable, basically, even though everyone else was screaming and flipping out. I wasn't allowed to. So in these occasions where I was forced to take a side, it made both of my parents basically more paranoid about what we thought of them compared to the other parent. And this was true for both of them, and they'd both accuse us of liking the other more than them, or just say, I know you do. But it was especially the case with my mom. She's read into things a lot for as long as I've known her, but she began more to read into everything I did for signs of negative intentions towards her, basically. If I was laughing with my brother about something, she might take it to mean that I was making fun of her with him because I liked my dad better, which wasn't true at all. But so she reacted strongly to most everything. Sometimes that would be actively with strong words and intense emotion, sometimes passive-aggressively, where she would just imply that she distrusted us rather than state it, so that, we couldn't really rebut anything at all. We just had to, because she's not saying that she doesn't trust us, she's just implying it. Or sometimes passively, with her mood just silently changing completely and all of a sudden acting differently towards everything else that happens from then on, and we just have to kind of clue into the fact that that's happened. And I felt terrible whenever I felt like I caused this, but I rarely knew what I was doing that caused it. So I began to overthink everything that I said and look for subtle signs that I had done something wrong so I could try to calm things down before it got worse, and, stifle any signs of happiness so she couldn't read into them. And so this is sort of the start of AvPD hyperfixations into myself and others, because I'm super worried about anything I do being taken the wrong way, and always looking for signs that has happened on other people. So, sometime during middle school, not very far into it, I started being asked to help more with chores. So with my mom, this was things like cleaning around the house, and with my dad, it was outside work. And so most of these things are not necessarily particularly difficult things, but they're things that I hadn't learned how to do before, and because it turned out they weren't really interested in taking the time to teach me how to do them. They just wanted me to be able to do them so that I could help them save time, which of course I understand, and I don't mind being asked to help with chores at all. But I mean, obviously as a middle schooler, I took some objection in the usual procrastination form, but I didn't really have a problem with it, but I didn't really know what I was doing, and they didn't really want to tell me. So my mom would take issue with the smallest mistakes I made with these things, and exasperatedly complain without actually pointing out specific mistakes, even when I specifically asked her. And she would usually insist on redoing the chore herself and making it clear that I hadn't been helpful and I just wasted her time. And whenever I was given a chance to redo it, she still wouldn't tell me what it is that I had done wrong, so I just had to do the whole thing again and hope it turned out better. And she'd usually just say, good enough, in an annoyed way, and I still wouldn't know whether it was good enough or not. And my dad didn't really understand, or he couldn't accept that as a 13-year-old nerd, I wasn't very strong and I wasn't very good at a lot of outside chores like chopping firewood or things like that. And when I had to do things like mowing the lawn in the summer heat, I would have to take breaks frequently because I was the type of kid that barely went outside. I still don't a whole lot, but I obviously have more endurance now as an adult than I did as a child. But I had to take breaks a lot, and every time I did, I would just sort of get a head shake from him, or a roll of the eyes, or a rhetorical question about why it wasn't done. And when I finally finished, he wouldn't thank me for doing it or anything. He would just say, you could have been done with that 5 times by now. And he wasn't wrong about that. It's just that it wasn't a very useful thing for me to hear. So it felt like they never really tried to understand why I'd make any mistake that I had, whether it was academic or behavioral or chore related. And if they overreacted, sometimes I felt like they eventually knew that they had, but they would never really apologize for it. And I could never really expect forgiveness for any mistakes I made, so I just had to wait for them to forget, pretty much. And I feel like this treatment sort of mentally conditioned me to do my best, not because I wanted to be praised or to have thanks or to help somebody out, or to feel good about myself, but just to avoid being ridiculed. So when possible, I would just try to avoid getting in any situations where there are any expectations of me at all. And so I kind of just stopped caring about what I thought about myself at all and just focused on worrying about what other people thought about me. Because, you always have to be around yourself, and you can always work towards making yourself feel better about yourself, or at least I thought so at the time. But it's really hard to change what other people think about you sometimes, whether it's because of first impressions. People they can decide they don't have to spend any more time around you if they don't like you, and you always have to be around yourself. So it felt like I really needed to worry about what people thought of me if I wanted to be able to be around anybody. So then when my anxiety started getting really bad, partially because of how these things made me feel about myself, and partially because of events that I talked about in my life story video, in combination with difficult social situations, basically. My parents really didn't understand my anxiety getting bad. They thought it was tied to specific events or that I'd grow out of it, and they didn't understand when I tried to explain why I was acting differently towards them sometimes, and they really weren't able to be accommodating because they didn't understand and they couldn't just accept it either. So things like how I just really needed more personal space and time than I had before, and than most people usually did, and that my siblings did. How I just really couldn't take much public interaction, and I wasn't trying to be difficult. How I was just going to be sort of in a low emotional state, even if I wasn't actively depressed yet. I was just quiet and tired, and they didn't really understand that either. As well as just having patience with my scattered thoughts, because your brain doesn't work so well when you're dealing with all of this, especially when you are just starting to deal with it and you really can't quite figure out what's going on with yourself. So, this sort of showed itself in that my dad was still always irked by little things that I'd forget to do whenever he'd have to remind me of something, or my anxiety in going in a store with him to help him carry something or whatever. And my mom being offended when I couldn't pretend to be happy or excited for her like she wanted me to. She didn't want me to pretend, obviously, but pretending is what I would have had to do. Or when I didn't want to talk about my day because it went poorly and I didn't really feel like talking through it. Or when I didn't want to give her hugs and physical affection, she thought I didn't love her, which wasn't true. But I just have a lot of difficulty with that. And that started around this time, and I couldn't figure out how to make them understand or accept this stuff, and so it just made our relationship more difficult. So, after my first year of high school, I had to learn how to drive a car to start taking myself and my brother to school. And I wasn't really excited about this at all because there were no social activities I wanted to participate in, so it was pretty much just something I had to do for just going to school, and so that didn't make me any more interested or comfortable doing it because I didn't have any positive reason for wanting to do it. And I was already super anxious about it because, driving mixes a form of social anxiety with other difficulties, like just the difficulty of driving. And especially for me, I've always had poor hand-eye coordination. I'm having a bit of a stroke. Don't worry about that. So anyway, I was super anxious about driving, and it had to be taught by my parents, and since they had tried to teach me things before, I had some idea of how that would most likely go down. My mom had helped teach my sister how to drive, but after that, she didn't want to do it again, so me and my brother would have to do it with just my dad. So he tried to maintain patience for a few minutes at the start, but it didn't really last long. The first time we went out, there was a whole lot of yelling at me to stay in my lane, don't hit the mailbox, speed up, slow down. Yeah. And it was clear just in my peripheral vision that he was constantly on edge, even when he wasn't actively, angrily yelling. And that's how it went most of the time that I was learning, even though I did improve substantially, and I'm pretty decent at driving at this point. But, he never really explained much of anything in the first place other than the very basics. He's not necessarily the most studious follower of driving laws himself, so I guess that shouldn't have been surprising. But anyway, this way that this went down sort of made me become very paranoid, especially when driving, but sort of in general. And I felt like I was too stupid to learn something that everyone else had to learn. Even though, of course, now I know a lot of people have difficulty learning to drive, and there can be better scenarios for learning it than the one I was in as well. And it doesn't make you stupid if you can't learn how to drive, of course. But I wasn't doing that poorly, but I felt like I was because of the way he was acting, and I began to feel like I had never been able to do anything right because I looked back at my life and in context of how poorly I seemed to be doing at this and how poorly he seemed to think I was doing. And, I did okay academically throughout the years, but that didn't really count because I had been taught that was just a minimum for everyone that wanted to have a good life. And, of course, that's not true. You don't have to be an academic expert to have a good life. And if you do succeed at academics, that is something that matters, but I didn't see it that way at the time. And I knew I was decent at playing an instrument, but that didn't really count because I'd quit band by this point, and I knew music wasn't going to lead to success anyway, the way I had been taught of what success was. And pretty much all that left was everything else that my parents had tried to teach me how to do, and I was terrible at all of those things. And surely if I was doing any part of it right, they would have told me, I thought, and they must have gotten angry because I was uniquely bad at doing these things. And they wouldn't have frustratedly given up on trying to help me understand my mistakes if they thought I was able to learn from my mistakes. Or at least that's what I thought. And they always insisted I wasn't stupid when I didn't learn. It's just that I was being lazy and I wasn't applying myself enough. I didn't care enough. And when I first drove with my mom as a passenger, she acted just as terrified, probably more terrified and overcorrecting than my dad had, even though I had improved substantially by this time. And so it felt like as much as they disagreed on, they agreed that I was a terrible driver, so that must be true. The truth is really that they never tried to teach me. They just wanted me to learn to take the stress off of them, but they didn't necessarily have the energy or time to put in the effort to actually teach me how to do it. They weren't trying to make me feel bad with the ways they acted towards me. They just, that's just honestly how they felt about it, and they didn't know how to tell me how to do any better, and they didn't realize that I wasn't going to be able to keep trying to succeed if they kept treating me like that. So, I started to feel it around that time that I was so worthless that I couldn't even speak to them without irritating them. They just didn't value anything I had to say. And maybe that's because I wasn't saying anything of value. My dad always began conversations with an exasperated sigh. And if I ever made any mistake or asked a question he thought I should know the answer to or anything like that, he very quickly became angry at me just because it felt like he was so annoyed that I wasn't able to get anything right. And Mom always made me feel guilty and insisted that I loved Dad more, or that I hadn't tried to spend enough time doing the things with her she wanted to prove that I loved her. Usually things that caused me significant anxiety at this point, doing things in public usually. Or that I hadn't been emotively appreciative enough of her at the right times, or that I had gotten emotional myself in ways that she thought were inappropriate when she reflected this negative emotion onto me. And it just felt like neither of them saw me as an individual or recognized my anxiety. They appreciated me only as a son, and they didn't care about the person that I had actually turned out to be. So they loved me in that sense of their child, but not in the sense of who I actually am. It's kind of hard to explain, but that's just how it felt and still sort of feels. So I think that should explain, at least to anyone who's familiar with AvPD, why that caused my AvPD. You know, I sort of developed this fear and expectation of judgment because it felt like they passed up opportunities to praise me because they were concerned with themselves, and I understand why that was, and I don't necessarily, actively blame them for not just being nice or more at more opportunities, but it did make me feel bad, especially when combined with how they treated me, how they judged me when I was trying to succeed at things, basically, and how the ways they analyzed my reactions caused my hyperfixations into myself and into others, and how all of this combined to sort of make me feel worthless and cause my depression, and as well as the fear of sharing myself, like my interests and emotions and all of that. It's a whole bunch of small things, but I think I probably explained why. I sort of feel like that caused that. And again, I don't like to blame them because, it is what it is, and I just want to move on from myself, and I want other people dealing with this sort of thing to maybe understand how a relationship with their parents might have affected them in a similar way, and how they can try to work past how guilty they feel about, conflict between how it feels like things our parents did caused us these problems, but, we don't want to feel like we're blaming them, so we feel guilty. But we need to be able to work past that, so I think it's important to talk about it. Yeah. And one other thing I wanted to mention about how they made me feel, this isn't exactly AvPD related, but it kind of is. So with the self-loathing, I didn't really understand how anyone would be able to love me. And so when my parents said they did, it felt like a combination of guilt, and they're just wanting me to stop being a burden physically and emotionally and start being useful. Because like I said, in their eyes, I was sort of choosing not to. They would never say that explicitly, but they did explicitly say things like, "You're not applying yourself," when I insisted that I was, and I know that I was. So, to me, I still sort of have this issue where just hearing the word love or hearing about the concept just sort of makes my stomach hurt, because it makes me feel those negative feelings of not really love, but guilt, and wanting someone to be more like what you want them to be like. So you're just sort of saying you love them to try to convince them to just accept their place, sort of, is how it feels to me. And my parents, insisted they loved each other, and I didn't see how they possibly could have. And it felt like, for me, an excuse for the decisions that they'd made for whatever reason in their life, maybe because they were just physically attracted to each other and that they ended up regretting. So I didn't really have an easy time believing love was real in the positive sense that most people mean it, until very recently, as I worked through some of my difficulties with learning about what AvPD was and thinking about it in context of myself and talking to you guys and all of that. So just to close out, I sort of talked about in a couple of videos why I got my AvPD diagnosis when I already knew I had AvPD. I sought the diagnosis from a doctor because I thought it might help my family, especially my parents, understand the difficulties I have, what they are, and why they are real, not so that I can blame them or that they feel guilty, just so that they can be more patient dealing with my shortcomings and, try not to force me into situations that are uncomfortable for me. I can't really give my mom hugs, and she still doesn't understand that. And, I can't go do things in public, and everyone still has difficulty understanding that, because it's just this, it's just that, it's just a small thing to them, but it's not to me. So unfortunately, my diagnosis didn't really help much with that, like I mentioned in a couple videos, because, people are pretty set in their ways and their understandings, and they have their own problems, and it's very difficult for people to try to understand others. And I know that. I put forth a lot of effort, I think, to try to understand others' problems, because I know how hard mine are to understand for people that aren't dealing with it. But in any case, it doesn't seem like it's made much of a difference. But fortunately, just knowing about AvPD and doing more research on it and doing these videos, talking through this stuff, writing my book, and talking to you guys has really helped me a lot in forgiving myself of some of my shortcomings so that I can slowly make progress with them. And it is very slow, but I think I'm doing a good job. Socially is going to take the longest. I was able to get my prescription refilled by myself and get gas the other day, which I was proud of, and hopefully we'll be able to continue doing and maybe move into actual things where I actually talk to other people at some point. But, I've made a lot of progress mentally, and it doesn't really make it any easier at the hardest times, but it makes me want to try harder when it's not easy. So, oh yeah, this video turned out to still be a pretty rambling mess, but anyway, I hope that is somewhat interesting or helpful to the people who wanted me to talk about this and to anyone else. And yeah, I think I've talked enough for now. I need some water. So thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful in some way, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.